A police officer's brutal attack left a black veteran in a deep coma, thinking his authority would shield him and the truth would stay buried forever. But what he didn't know was that the victim's son, a relentless and determined man, was ready to bring everything into the light. What happens when the truth is exposed and an entire corrupt system crumbles under the weight of justice? Follow this gripping story as it takes you through moments of pain, hope, and unstoppable change. If you love inspiring and emotional stories like this, make sure to like, share, and follow us to never miss what's coming next. The golden hues of the late afternoon sun bathed a quiet southern street as John Carter, a black Vietnam War veteran, walked with steady steps along a familiar path. Time had curved his once proud frame, but his unyielding gait and dignified presence continued to command respect from those around him. That day, after an afternoon spent reminiscing with fellow veterans over coffee, recounting old stories, his heart felt unburdened in a way that was rare. As he crossed the central square, his eyes caught an unsettling sight. A small crowd had gathered near a park bench where a police officer was cornering a young man, leaving him no room to retreat. John quickly recognized the officer as Kyle Mitchell, notorious for his aggressive handling of situations, particularly towards people of color. The young man, barely in his 20s, was trembling as he fumbled to retrieve something from his jacket pocket. The air grew thick with tension, all eyes fixated on the pair, yet no one dared to intervene. Sensing impending danger, John inhaled deeply and decided to step forward, breaking the oppressive silence. "Calm down, everyone. There's nothing serious going on here," John spoke with a deep yet reassuring voice, addressing both the crowd and the officer. Kyle turned, narrowing his eyes at John, clearly displeased by the interruption. "This doesn't concern you, Carter," Kyle retorted coldly. John, however, directed his gaze toward the young man, who shakily pulled out an ID card and handed it to Kyle. Without so much as a glance, Kyle snatched it rudely and shoved it into his pocket. Maintaining his composure, John replied evenly, "I was just passing by and saw that everything seems to be under control." Kyle's irritation visibly intensified, his jaw tightening as if ready to erupt at the slightest provocation. He took a menacing step toward John, using his larger frame to intimidate the older man. But John, a survivor of real battles, stood firm and unmoved. "I've witnessed situations like this before," John said, his voice low but steady. "I know how quickly things can escalate." Kyle, feeling challenged in front of the growing crowd, flushed with anger. John remained unwavering, a picture of resilience and justice, his calm demeanor only aggravating Kyle further. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, tension in the air stretched to its breaking point. "There's no need for violence here," John continued, his voice as steady as a gentle breeze cutting through the officer's rage. His piercing gaze locked onto Kyle, exuding an unshakable determination, silently questioning the officer's actions. This quiet defiance was like pouring fuel on a smoldering fire. Kyle's face turned crimson, his facial muscles twitching with suppressed fury. Without warning, Kyle shoved John forcefully. The elder veteran staggered back, his aged joints protesting in pain. Gasps rippled through the crowd, who stood frozen in the wake of this sudden escalation. John straightened himself slowly, adjusting his stance despite the sharp pangs coursing through his body. His resolve did not falter. His voice, now carrying the weight of a man who had faced war and survived, dropped to a measured, commanding tone. "Kyle, calm yourself," he said firmly. But Kyle was past reasoning, his teeth clenched, his eyes blazing with unrestrained anger, his fists balled tightly at his sides. In a burst of uncontrolled rage, he swung his fist directly at John. The punch landed squarely on John's face, sending him sprawling to the ground. His head struck the pavement with a sickening thud, and blood began to seep from a wound at the back of his head. For a moment, the square was deathly silent. Then chaos erupted. Some rushed to John's aid, while others pulled out their phones to capture the shocking scene. Kyle stood frozen, his face drained of color, his breath ragged as the weight of his actions set in. Frantically, he grabbed his radio, calling for backup in a shaky voice, already spinning a narrative to shift blame. "The suspect attacked first," he barked, his voice faltering as he struggled to reclaim control of the situation. The crowd, however, had seen it all. The truth was laid bare, recorded and witnessed by many. As John lay motionless on the cold pavement, his bravery and steadfastness in the face of injustice would not be forgotten, sparking a reckoning in the hearts of those who had stood by in silence. Meanwhile, John lay motionless on the ground, blood pooling beneath his head, his body alarmingly still. A few onlookers frantically dialed for an ambulance, while a woman nearby broke into tears, her hands trembling in horror at the brutal scene she had just witnessed. The young man at the center of the confrontation stood frozen, his wide eyes filled with terror as he glanced at Kyle, who was visibly shaken. Though his breathing was labored, Kyle still clung to a facade of authority. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics moved swiftly, their actions precise yet urgent. One murmured to his colleague in a grim tone, "Head trauma, possible brain injury, we need to transport him immediately." They carefully secured John onto a stretcher, doing their best to stabilize him. The gathered crowd stood in stunned silence, their faces etched with shock. John, once a symbol of respect and resilience, now lay vulnerable and victimized by senseless cruelty. Before the ambulance doors closed, someone asked if John would be all right. One paramedic gave a terse, worried response. "I can't say for sure." The ambulance sped away, its sirens wailing, but the suffocating tension lingered in the air. Kyle stood alone, acutely aware of the weight of the crowd's stares piercing through him like silent daggers of judgment. His chest tightened, his hands balled into fists, yet he could do nothing but remain rooted in place, feeling the crushing burden of accountability settling on his shoulders. Suddenly, a man stepped forward. His voice was calm, yet unmistakably firm as he declared, "That wasn't self-defense, Kyle. We all saw what you did." Kyle's body stiffened. His gaze flickered between the man and the crowd, where murmurs began to ripple, growing louder with each passing second. Though no one dared to confront him outright, the wave of unspoken accusations swelled, encircling him. Isolation and reality pressed down on him, and he realized the gravity of his actions extended far beyond what he could have imagined. Kyle tried to regain control, his voice rising in desperation as he shouted to quiet the growing unrest. But the authority he once wielded so effortlessly was slipping through his fingers. The crowd no longer heeded his commands. Instead, they raised their phones, recording every movement, every word. The footage, vivid and unflinching, would soon become evidence Kyle knew could ruin him. Panic churned in Kyle's gut. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead as he realized the situation was spiraling beyond his control. He turned and paced, his steps short and frantic, scrambling to devise a way to salvage his position before more officers arrived. When the police chief finally appeared minutes later, Kyle rushed to speak first, desperate to seize the narrative. "Things got out of hand, sir," Kyle began, his voice strained. "That man interfered while I was questioning the boy. He was aggressive, and I had no choice but to defend myself." The police chief, an older man with streaks of gray in his hair, regarded Kyle in silence. His eyes drifted to the blood-stained pavement where John had fallen. With a deep sigh, he spoke, his voice low and cutting, just loud enough for Kyle to hear. "I don't care about your excuses, Mitchell. This is already a disaster. You better pray my report can save you." The chief turned and ordered another officer to disperse the crowd, leaving Kyle standing there, sweat chilling on his skin as he grasped the gravity of his predicament. This wasn't a minor incident he could sweep under the rug. It was a catastrophe, one that Kyle hadn't anticipated. News of the event spread like wildfire. Videos of the confrontation flooded social media, igniting outrage across the community. The town, once simmering with quiet discontent over police violence, now erupted in fury. Signs bearing the words "Justice for John" were hastily scrawled and hoisted high as a growing crowd gathered at Freedom Square. Their voices, once whispers of concern, rose to an angry crescendo, demanding accountability. What had once been a hidden fear of systemic abuse had transformed into a full-throated outcry for change, echoing through the streets and reverberating across the nation. At St. Hope Medical Center, Henry Collins lay unconscious on the hospital bed, his body unresponsive, his future uncertain. Dr. Mark Allen worked tirelessly to reduce the swelling in his brain, but there were no guarantees. Outside the hospital, friends and family gathered in solemn prayer for Henry's recovery. Among them were veterans who had served alongside him, their faces etched with grief and an undeniable fury. They understood that a man like Henry, who had survived the horrors of war, now lay on the edge of life and death because of a violent confrontation in his own hometown. In his office, Ethan Collins, Henry's son and the state's attorney general, was immersed in his work when the call came through. The anxious voice on the other end informed him of his father's condition. The news hit Ethan like a crushing blow. Henry, the resilient figure who had always been his pillar of strength, was now lying unconscious because of a police officer's actions. Ethan sat motionless, his thoughts spiraling, anger surging within him. This wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was an affront to the very justice he had devoted his life to upholding. Ethan rose to his feet, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't go to St. Hope Medical Center as a grieving son. He would go as the Attorney General, a man wielding the authority to challenge an unjust system. As night fell, Ethan Collins walked into St. Hope Medical Center. His mind raced with thoughts, but his face remained calm, a mask honed through years of public service. He had learned to control his emotions, to compartmentalize them until the moment demanded action. But as he stepped into the room and saw his father, Henry Collins, lying motionless on the bed, a man who had raised him to fight for what was right, Ethan felt a visceral tension coursing through his entire being. Henry's arms rested limply by his sides, his face pale, too frail to endure any further pain. The mechanical beeping of the monitors filled the quiet room, each sound a somber reminder of the seconds slipping away. Ethan stood silently in the corner, his hands clenched tightly at his sides as if willing his strength into his father's still form. A nurse entered, her face somber. She spoke softly, her words carefully chosen. "Mr. Collins's condition is stable for now, but the head trauma remains critical. We've done everything we can." Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving his father's face. His hand gripped the edge of the chair tightly, his breathing heavy, each breath carrying the weight of helplessness creeping in. The nurse offered a faint, empathetic smile before quietly leaving the room, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. The steady beeping of the machines filled the silence, a cruel metronome counting down time he knew he couldn't waste. His mind flashed to the heated phone call he'd had earlier with the officer responsible for the attack. An officer who had irreparably changed the course of his father's life. His chest burned with anger, his fists clenched, and with every passing second, the fire of rage inside him grew hotter. His father, a man who had devoted his life to serving his country, now lay incapacitated because of someone meant to protect him. The hypocrisy of it all felt like a stone lodged in Ethan's chest, pressing harder with every thought. But Ethan wouldn't let his emotions consume him. There was too much to do. When he stepped out of St. Hope Medical Center, the atmosphere outside was no longer calm. News of the incident had spread rapidly, and crowds had gathered outside the police station, holding signs emblazoned with Henry Collins's name. Videos of the attack had gone viral, and the entire state was now watching, awaiting justice. Reporters swarmed him, cameras and microphones thrust in his face. Questions bombarded him from every direction. "Attorney General Collins, can you update us on your father's condition? What's your reaction to the officer's actions?" Ethan paused, his jaw tightening as the weight of the moment settled on him. He knew that every word he said would carry immense significance, not just for his father, but for an entire community demanding answers and accountability. Ethan drew a deep breath, his eyes sharp and unyielding as they cut through the chaos around him. His voice rang out, firm and resolute. "My father is in critical condition. There will be a thorough investigation, and I will not rest until the truth is uncovered and justice is served." His words silenced the crowd. Without another word, Ethan turned and strode purposefully toward his car. Inside the vehicle, his legal team was already at work, gathering evidence. Ethan prepared to confront the system that had allowed this tragedy to occur, determined that the officer responsible for his father's injuries would face the full weight of the law. He knew this wasn't just a personal battle. It was a fight for justice against a system he believed was beginning to rot from within. Fueled by a burning anger, Ethan braced himself for the arduous battle ahead. The next morning, a heavy pall hung over the town. Henry Collins, once a respected figure, had become a symbol of the fight for justice. But for Ethan, this wasn't about symbolism or headlines in the press. It was about his father. The image of Henry lying motionless in the hospital haunted him relentlessly, a burden he couldn't shake. At his office, Ethan met with a team of legal advisors. He had spent the entire night reviewing every piece of evidence: witness testimonies, videos of the attack, police reports. The truth came into sharp focus. It wasn't just Officer Kyle Mitchell. There were systemic issues within the police department itself. The video evidence was irrefutable, and Ethan knew it was time to act. The advisors unearthed Mitchell's personnel file, uncovering a history of complaints about harassment and abuse of power that had been swept under the rug. Ethan gripped the file tightly, his eyes flashing with determination. "Nothing stays hidden anymore," he declared, his voice steady and commanding. "We'll prosecute Mitchell, but this won't stop with him. I want a full investigation into how the department handled these complaints. If there's corruption, we'll expose it, and anyone who protected him will be held accountable." The team nodded, knowing full well that Ethan wasn't one to back down from a fight. Under his leadership, justice wouldn't be silenced. Meanwhile, at the police station, Kyle Mitchell sat in tense silence. His entire body was rigid, his eyes darting around nervously as the world around him seemed to spiral out of control. News coverage, protests, and relentless criticism had backed him into a corner. He knew there was nowhere left to hide. The police chief stood before Kyle, his expression grave. "We'll do everything we can to protect you," the chief said. "But if Ethan Collins is leading this investigation, there's no one who can shield you." That afternoon, Ethan held his first press conference outside the Brighton County Courthouse. The atmosphere was charged, the tension palpable, as camera flashes lit up the podium. Reporters shouted questions over one another, their voices a cacophony of urgency. Ethan stood tall, his face cold and resolute, his eyes burning with a determination that was impossible to ignore. He exuded an unshakable resolve, driven by a clear mission. "We will conduct a full investigation into the events that took place at the park," Ethan began, his voice unwavering. "No one, absolutely no one, will be shielded from accountability. Justice will be served. Officer Kyle Mitchell's actions will no longer be hidden." As Ethan declared, "We will prosecute Officer Mitchell for the violent actions against my father, Henry Collins." The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. Reporters furiously scribbled notes, every word carrying weight. Ethan, already known for his uncompromising stance against corruption, now stood at the forefront of a battle for justice. With his father lying in critical condition at St. Hope Medical Center, no one doubted the depth of his resolve. Ethan continued, his tone resolute. "This investigation won't stop at one officer's actions. We will review all past complaints against him and expose any misconduct within the police department. Anyone complicit in covering up his abuses will face consequences." His words landed like a hammer, a powerful promise to root out the rot in the system. A reporter abruptly stood, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Attorney General Collins, can you provide an update on your father's condition? Any new developments?" For a moment, Ethan's expression softened, emotions flickering briefly across his face before he regained his composure. "My father remains in critical condition," he said in a steady, subdued tone.
"We continue to hope, but we are preparing for all possibilities."
The room fell into a heavy silence. The weight of Ethan's words was unmistakable. The reporters exchanged glances, sensing the immense burden he carried, but also recognizing his indomitable will. The press conference ended swiftly, but Ethan's message was clear. He would pursue justice relentlessly, and nothing would stand in his way. After the press conference, Ethan returned to the police station. Inside, the police chief sat quietly, gazing out the window where a growing crowd of protesters chanted for justice for Henry Collins. He turned back to find Kyle Mitchell huddled in a corner, his hands clutching his head, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The walls were closing in, and Kyle knew the reckoning he had long evaded was finally upon him. "We can't shield you from this," the police chief said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "You're on your own." Kyle didn't respond. His shoulders trembled slightly, the weight of the protesters' chants pressing against his chest like a physical force. The slogans outside felt suffocating, each one echoing the inevitable collapse of his world. He wanted to run, but deep down, Kyle knew there was no escape. Everything was now beyond his control. At his office, Ethan sat in front of his computer, its glow illuminating the tension etched across his face. Days had passed since the attack on his father, and while his team had made significant strides in the investigation, the pressure of the case weighed heavily on him. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of his father lying motionless in the hospital bed came rushing back, accompanied by the steady beeping of the machines keeping him alive. The sudden ring of his phone shattered the silence. On the other end, an investigator's voice carried urgency. "We've uncovered new evidence. We dug deeper into Mitchell's past. It's worse than we thought." Ethan sat upright, his jaw tightening. He had suspected that Mitchell's misconduct was only the tip of the iceberg, that there were years of cover-ups within the police department. His anger flared, but his voice remained calm and resolute. "Bring everything you have here, memos, internal reports, anything they've tried to bury. We're going to expose it all." The investigator replied, "There's more coming. We're still sorting through it." Ethan hung up and stared out the window. The crowd of protesters had grown larger, their voices a collective cry for justice that filled the air with tension. He knew that if justice wasn't served soon, the situation would spiral further out of control, but he couldn't afford to falter. This was a fight he had to see through, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Kyle Mitchell sat in his cramped apartment, where he had been hiding for days. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the small TV in front of him relentlessly replayed news reports about the incident. Each headline, every social media post by the protesters outside the police station, painted him as a villain. Suspended from duty, his career was effectively over. The police chief had abandoned him, telling him to stay silent and wait it out. But Kyle knew that as long as Ethan Collins led the investigation, there would be no reprieve. Ethan walked slowly through the familiar streets of the town, each step feeling heavier than the last. He couldn't stop thinking about what his father had endured, the sacrifices and pain. Each step bore the weight of justice and the promise he had made to his father, to fight, not just for him, but for everyone the system had failed. Kyle's phone buzzed suddenly, breaking the oppressive silence of his apartment. He glanced at the screen, hesitated, then answered. The cold, measured voice of his lawyer greeted him. "They've got video evidence, and when they dug into your record, it got worse. I don't have many options left unless you agree to a deal." "What?" Kyle felt a chill run through him. A deal? That couldn't be an option. He couldn't face prison. His choices were dwindling, and desperation clawed at him. "Carter's building a solid case," the lawyer continued. "If you don't cooperate, they'll bring everything they've got against you." Kyle remained silent, his jaw clenched tightly. He knew the lawyer was right, but fear was consuming him. It wasn't just the public outrage he faced now, it was the real looming consequences of his actions. The specter of a prison sentence hung over him, and for the first time, he realized how cornered he truly was. At St. Hope Medical Center, Henry's condition showed no signs of improvement. Dr. Mark Allen had done everything possible, but Henry remained in a deep coma, and his prognosis was uncertain. Friends and former comrades took turns keeping vigil by his bedside, their quiet presence a testament to unwavering solidarity. Each day, Ethan visited St. Hope Medical Center, carving out precious moments to be with his father. But every time he saw Henry, it felt like a crushing weight pressed against his chest. Henry, once so strong and unyielding, now lay motionless, clinging faintly to life. One evening, as Ethan sat by the hospital bed, he placed his hand gently over his father's. His voice was soft, but resolute. "I'll do everything I can. I'll get justice for you, I promise." The steady beeping of the machines and the rhythm of Henry's heartbeat were the only sounds in the room. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and grief. Doubts occasionally crept into his mind, questioning whether he had the strength to carry on this fight. It was so personal, so consuming. But then he remembered his father's words, "Never stop until justice is done." With that thought, Ethan's determination solidified. He wiped his eyes, stood tall, and reminded himself that there was still much work to be done. As long as his father continued to fight for his life, Ethan would fight relentlessly for justice. At the Brighton Police Department, the atmosphere was stifling. Ethan Collins entered with an expression that betrayed nothing, yet his presence radiated a commanding energy that was impossible to ignore. Police Chief Leland Green sat behind his desk, arms crossed, attempting to maintain a calm demeanor, though the tension in the room was undeniable. Ethan didn't sit. His voice was cold and resolute as he began, "We don't have time for pleasantries. This isn't a meeting to exchange small talk." Chief Green forced a strained smile, but it didn't reach his eyes under Ethan's piercing gaze. "McDougal acted on his own," Green said. "He wasn't part of any broader misconduct by the department." Ethan cut him off sharply. "This isn't just about one officer. It's about how you've handled complaints, the cover-ups, and the culture of silence you've allowed to fester under your leadership." Green shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face falling as exhaustion and frustration seeped into his expression. He had known Ethan for years, back when the young attorney was just starting his career. But now, standing before him, was a different Ethan, unyielding, relentless, and resolute. "We have evidence," Ethan continued, his tone unwavering, "an internal memo documenting complaints against Mitchell that were dismissed without proper investigation. That memo bears your signature." Green was silent, unable to refute the claim. He knew Ethan wasn't bluffing. If this came to light, it wouldn't just end his career. It would expose the police department as a haven for corruption. "We're prosecuting Kyle Mitchell for assault and misconduct," Ethan said, his voice steady yet charged with authority. "But we're not stopping there. We're launching a full investigation into this department." Ethan emphasized each word. Every complaint, every report, every cover-up meant to protect corrupt officers. All of it will be exposed. Green gripped the edge of his desk tightly, but he couldn't hide the fear rising within him. "Your duty wasn't to shield bad officers," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "It was to protect this community. You failed in that duty. Now you'll face the consequences." The room fell into an oppressive silence, heavy with the weight of Ethan's words. Green knew there was no escape. He searched for a way out, but the truth was inescapable. He could only sit, his face etched with defeat. "What do you want from me?" Green asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stood firm, his tone icy and commanding when he finally spoke. "I want full cooperation. I want every file, every memo, every email related to Mitchell's misconduct on my desk by the end of the day." His words carried a gravity that left no room for negotiation. Green had no options left. Ethan turned and walked out of the office, each step measured and resolute, a silent declaration that justice would prevail no matter the cost. Behind him, Green sat motionless, staring at the closed door. His career dangled by a thread, and the impending collapse of the police department loomed like a storm on the horizon. Kyle Mitchell sat in his barren apartment, his mind a blank void. Fear clung to him like a suffocating shadow, wrapping around his every thought. He stared at the wall ahead, feeling each passing hour as an unbearable weight pressing down on him. Every time he turned on the TV or checked his phone, his name blazed across the headlines. Kyle Mitchell, the officer responsible for beloved veteran's Coma. Arrest. His lawyer had advised him to remain silent and composed, but Kyle knew that nothing could salvage his situation now. The truth was out, and there was nothing he could do to change it. Sitting motionless, his empty gaze fixed on nothing in particular, Kyle's pallid face betrayed the crushing burden of the indictment. Every word in the charges felt like a heavy stone pressing against his chest. Everything was now beyond his control. The evidence, video recordings, witness testimonies, and internal reports the department had buried for years had all come to light. When the judge adjourned the hearing, every pair of eyes in the courtroom turned toward Kyle. His attorney, Linda Coop, resigned on the spot, while reporters and spectators tracked Kyle's every move as he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. The indictment had been formalized, and now Kyle would face trial with no escape in sight. Inside the courtroom, there were no cheers or applause, only a heavy, chilling silence. But outside, it was a different story. As news of Kyle Mitchell's indictment spread, the crowd outside Brighton County Courthouse erupted in elation. For the first time in weeks, they felt a glimmer of hope that justice might finally be served, and that a corrupt system enabling officers like Kyle would be forced to change. Guilt and fear coursed through Kyle's veins like icy water, seeping into every part of him. Every article, every criticism dredged up his past, exposing every mistake and misdeed he had once tried to bury. Now there was no hiding. He recalled the moment Ethan Collins had confronted him, a heavy blow not just to the ground, but to his own sense of control. He hadn't intended for the old man to end up in a coma, but that no longer mattered. The damage was done, and Kyle knew his time was up. Everything was over. At his office, Ethan Collins stood silently by the large window, his gaze distant but purposeful. He could feel the tide of change swelling. The investigation he led was gaining momentum, each piece of the truth falling into place. It was only a matter of time before Kyle Mitchell and the corrupt system he symbolized would be exposed. "We've got everything we need," the lead investigator's confident voice echoed through the phone. "The reports are coming together. We've uncovered multiple complaints against Mitchell, racial bias, abuse of power, and excessive use of force. All of it covered up." Ethan nodded, a faint smile flickering across his face. "Keep going. We're going to tear it all down." He ended the call and turned his gaze to Freedom Square. The plaza was packed with protesters, their signs raised high in the air. The tension was palpable. Something monumental, something irreversible, was approaching. At Brighton County Courthouse, the atmosphere was stifling. Ethan and his legal team had spent weeks preparing for this day. Every lie, every suppressed report, every hidden truth was about to be unveiled. Today, justice would prevail. Ethan stared at the thick stack of files in front of him. The charges extended beyond misconduct and assault, encompassing racial prejudice, systemic bias, and abuse of power. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. Kyle would have to answer for every crime he had committed. The courtroom doors opened, and the lead investigator entered, his expression tense but resolute. "It's time," he said. Ethan rose to his feet, his hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of what lay ahead. This was the moment he had worked toward for so long. He wasn't just fighting for his father. He was fighting for every victim who had been silenced, every injustice that had been buried. This was a battle for justice, for the man who had suffered, for the system that had betrayed him, and for the truth that could no longer be ignored. And today, that system would face the consequences it so rightly deserved. Kyle Mitchell entered the courtroom, his once arrogant gaze now weary and vacant. His face was ashen, his steps heavy under the escort of 2 officers. Outside, the crowd's outrage surged like a storm, their jeers crashing through the air and amplifying the dread within him. Kyle kept his head down, walking in silence, feeling the weight of countless eyes boring into him. He had once believed he could escape it all, that the police department would shield him as they always had. But now, he faced the grim truth. He had been abandoned. There was no one left on his side. Only isolation remained. To the crowd, Kyle was a pariah, cast out like a lone wolf, banished from its pack. Everything he once thought was unshakable had crumbled completely. As Kyle climbed the steps of Brighton County Courthouse, the atmosphere around him seemed to shift. A system rife with corruption, one that had long protected his wrongdoings, now stood exposed with nowhere left to hide. Ethan Collins stood tall, his unflinching gaze fixed on Kyle, a man who had lost all strength to resist. Ethan knew this was the moment for justice to speak, for every sin to face its reckoning. The judge entered the room, and a heavy silence descended. Her voice, steady and authoritative, heightened the tension in the air. "We are gathered here to formally charge Officer Kyle Mitchell with assault, misconduct in office, and violations of civil rights." As the charges were read aloud, Ethan locked eyes with Kyle, offering not a trace of pity. The courtroom remained silent, braced for the legal storm about to unfold. Outside Brighton County Courthouse, the crowd erupted in celebration. News of Kyle Mitchell's indictment brought a glimmer of hope. It wasn't just a step toward justice. It was a signal that the rot in the system could finally be addressed. Justice, at last, seemed within reach. Ethan Collins stood resolutely on the courthouse steps, his expression firm as cameras and reporters swarmed, eager for his every word. His voice carried over the noise, steady and commanding. "This is only the beginning. Officer Kyle Mitchell will be held accountable for his actions in a court of law, and we will ensure that justice is served. But let me remind you, this isn't just about one individual. It's about a system that allowed such behavior to persist, a system that turned a blind eye to death, violence, and the suffering of my father. That system failed, and this community failed. We will not stop until every responsible party is held to account." The crowd roared with approval, the air electric with newfound hope. While the fight was far from over, this was a significant victory, a crucial step toward reclaiming justice long forgotten by the community. Inside Brighton Police Department, the weight of failure was palpable. Each file, each report that had been buried to protect Kyle Mitchell was now unearthed, laying bare years of corruption. Chief Green faced mounting pressure to resign as daily protests outside served as a relentless reminder of all that had gone wrong. Chaos gripped the department, and every new revelation hammered another nail into its crumbling reputation. Green's career lay in ruins, undone by the decisions he had made to protect the indefensible. Each misstep was now laid bare, demanding accountability. Suddenly, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was a call from St. Hope Medical Center. "Mr. Collins, there's been a change in your father's condition. We need you to come immediately." Ethan's chest tightened as if a vice had gripped his heart. He had known this moment would come, but he wasn't ready. He walked through the dim streets, the cheers of the crowd, and echoes of the protests fading into the background. St. Hope Medical Center loomed ahead, somber and foreboding. Though he had been here countless times before, tonight felt different. Inside, Henry, his father, lay motionless as ever, unchanged. But within the stillness, a deep fear gnawed at Ethan's soul, the weight of uncertainty pressing down as he prepared to face whatever awaited him. Dr. Mark Allen stood beside the hospital bed, his expression measured but serious. "He's stable, but if his condition doesn't improve, we'll need to consider other options." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. The legal battles, the indictments, the reforms, all of it suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the fragile line between life and death. He sank into the chair next to his father's bed, gripping Henry's hand tightly, his heart heavy with emotion. "I'm still fighting for you, Dad," he murmured. "We're seeking justice. But I need you to come back. I need you here." The steady beeping of the monitors filled the room, but in that moment, all Ethan felt was a deep emptiness enveloping him. Outside, the indictment against Kyle Mitchell continued to dominate conversations across the town. Protests swelled in numbers, but this time they weren't just fueled by anger. They carried a spark of hope. Faith in change had begun to stir. The trial date for Kyle was set, and Ethan knew this was just the beginning. But for him, an indictment wasn't enough. He wouldn't rest until the full truth was laid bare. In the days that followed, Ethan's team delved even deeper into police department records, uncovering systemic cover-ups of misconduct, violence, racial bias, and countless other violations. A culture of silence and complicity had festered for far too long. Ethan couldn't stand idly by any longer. Action was overdue. As the protests grew larger and the calls for accountability echoed louder, the pressure became too much to bear. Finally, Police Chief Green announced his resignation. The community had achieved a significant victory. It was a sign of genuine change, but for Ethan Collins, the work was far from over. He wouldn't stop until every wrong was made right. That evening, Ethan returned to St. Hope Medical Center. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. The familiar scent of antiseptic filled the air. He sat beside his father, Henry Collins, whose still form weighed heavily on his mind. Yet, for the first time in days, there was a glimmer of hope. "You taught me to fight for justice," Ethan whispered, his voice steady but full of emotion as he gazed at his father. "And I will never stop." In the stillness of the room, Ethan felt the enormity of the battle ahead. It wasn't just a fight for his father, it was a fight for everyone who had suffered injustice under a corrupt system. There was still a long road ahead, but he was ready to keep going, driven by the belief that justice would prevail. Ethan bowed his head and murmured, "Dad, I know you're still fighting, and I'll keep fighting too." The steady beep of the machines echoed softly in the background. Then, something miraculous happened. Henry's fingers twitched. The movement was faint, but enough for Ethan to notice. He froze, staring at his father's hand, his heart pounding as he saw the subtle trembling of Henry's fingers. "You're still here, aren't you?" Ethan whispered, his voice tight with emotion, his pulse racing. Henry had more battles ahead, but his condition began to improve. Though not fully recovered, hope had returned. The possibility that Henry might wake up was now real. As his father continued to fight for life, Ethan renewed his resolve to fight for justice. Together, they would press on, one fighting for survival, the other for truth. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, there was a reason to believe. The investigation into Kyle Mitchell continued, while reforms within the police department had begun to take shape. The town was slowly rebuilding itself from the ruins of a broken system. The road ahead remained long, but for the first time, there was a genuine sense that meaningful change was possible. As the sun set over the town, casting a golden glow, Ethan sat beside his father, his eyes fixed on Henry's weathered face. The lines etched into Henry's skin told the story of a life filled with hardship and resilience. At that moment, Ethan realized something profound. Strength isn't just found in the fight. It's found in the quiet determination to endure, to keep going, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Ethan studied his father for a long time, a surge of patience and hope welling up inside him. "We'll make it, Dad. I promise," he whispered. With hope in his heart and a brighter future on the horizon, Ethan rose to his feet. Justice was not only about punishing the guilty. It was about healing, about creating a world where people like his father could live without fear. The path ahead would be difficult, but Ethan Collins believed they were on the right track. And no matter how steep the climb, he would remain steadfast, fighting for a fairer future, a future they both deserved. Thank you for following this deeply moving story. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about the journey of healing and transforming an entire community. We hope Ethan's story and his unwavering commitment to his father have inspired you, just as they've inspired us. If you enjoy heartfelt and meaningful stories like this one, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any upcoming videos. Together, let's spread hope and belief in a brighter, better future.